Okay, everyone, I think we are ready to go. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Eugene Moharib. I'm a lecturer in the School of the Built Environment at the University of Reading in the United Kingdom, and also the research coordinator for the ISIE Sustainable Urban Systems section. I'll be moderating today's discussion, and this is an open webinar, freely accessible to all, with all of our recordings publicly accessible through the ISIE website. So for those of you who don't know, the ISIE, or the International Society for Industrial Ecology, promotes industrial ecology as a way of finding innovative solutions to complicated environmental problems and facilitates communication among scientists, engineers, policymakers, managers, and advocates who are interested in better integrating environmental concerns with economic activities. The mission of the ISIE is to promote the use of industrial ecology in research, education, policy, community development, and industrial practices. About the Sustainable Urban Systems section, the group has a stated purpose of engaging practitioners and researchers by providing a forum for multidisciplinary systems approaches to understand, plan, build, and manage sustainable, healthy, and resilient cities. We hold bi-monthly webinars to promote the work being done around urban sustainability, both within our group and beyond. Just to note a few housekeeping issues. You may have noticed that you need to allow access to your camera and microphone to join, but please note that we won't be using these at any point during the webinar today. To provide you with a structure, our presentation will run for approximately 45 minutes with 10 to 15 minutes at the conclusion for questions. Please submit any questions directly to me through a chat. You can search for me in the group section at the bottom there. Eugene Moharib, search for me under Find Someone to Chat With and type your questions directly to me if you wish. And I will relay these questions in our final 10 to 15 minutes with Dan after he speaks for about 45 minutes for his presentation. About our speaker, Dan Hoornweg, it's my pleasure to introduce Dan from Ontario Tech University in Oshawa, Ontario, Canada. Following almost 20 years with the World Bank, including as lead advisor overseeing the Sustainable Cities and Climate Change programs, Dan returned to Ontario in 2012. He and Richard Marceau chair at the Ontario Tech University. Dan's academic background includes earth sciences at the University of Waterloo, a master's in environmental engineering at the University of Guelph, and a PhD from University of Toronto in civil engineering with a focus on sustainability. Dan researches energy and material flows of cities and urban systems. He is also the Chief Safety and Risk Officer for the province of Ontario's Technical Standards and Safety Authority. I will now be handing over to Dan to take us through his presentation entitled Sustainability Through the World's Cities. Dan, hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Eugene. Hopefully everyone can hear me. If not, I'll wait for Eugene to send me a note. What I wanted to do today was to try and convince you on something that we're working on. I'm not 100% sure that it's true, but I think it's the best bet that we have. And the argument that I'll try and present is that really the only way we're going to get to sustainability on the planet is through sustainable development, but basically through the world's cities. So that's my pitch, and I'll see if I can convince you. So I think the slides have moved over a little bit, so bear with us on some of them. But generally, this is where we are. I think everybody knows this. The four big trends, you could call them waves, or the four riders of the apocalypse, perhaps. But these are the things that are driving the world and have since the Great Acceleration around 1950, 1960, and are likely the biggest drivers for the next 35 to 50 years. So we all know about urbanization, how it's growing inequality. It's basically urbanization and globalization are to some extent, especially from a materials perspective, energy perspective, say the two sides of the same coin. The the world's cities will double during the career. So I teach fourth year energy systems engineering, and the students really do not believe, and I'm still not even sure that I believe, even though that's what the numbers are pretty adamant saying, is that in their careers, not their lives, but their careers, the world's cities will double. So the planetary damage that's occurring at the moment is we're not even halfway there yet. Then we have this big issue of demographics, and we have some, I think, some interesting population scenarios that I'll share with you today. Climate change is a big one. The climate change, I think, goes hand in hand with the loss of biodiversity. And then the other big trend that we have is the whole information, the digital age, sharing economy. You've all heard we're on the fourth industrial revolution. Even in Davos, they're talking about it, so it must be real. All right, so all of that combined is the first time that humans have to deal with wicked problems. Some people say that the ozone depletion was the first example of a wicked problem, but to a large extent we solved that, even though China is giving us a bit of a run for our money in terms of still ozone depleting substances are being identified there. But we, to a large extent, were able to solve the ozone depleting problem. And it wasn't really a wicked problem, but climate change, biodiversity, these are the first big examples of a wicked problem. And what is a wicked problem? It really is, it's not this. There's not one bad person. It's not the Wicked Witch of the West or Donald Trump or Brexit or whatever. Those are really symptoms. Wicked problems, for me, it's kind of like a plate of spaghetti, and you have to deal with one or two individual strands. It's really messy. And what drives wicked problems are us, humans. When you get a bunch of humans together, it's our frailties, our insecurities, our egos, all of that mixed up, and especially in a city, you give us a bit of power and a bit of energy, we are the drivers of wicked problems. And they've always existed. It's just that the scale of the impact has changed. So this is what I would call the money slide. This is where we are. These numbers are pretty conservative, but I just wanted to point out we're around 2019. So the GDP per person on the planet is growing very fast. We have institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, all these sorts of things that were created really in the 1950s, and before that, when we had 11 cities that were maybe over 1 million, one over 10 million. Now in 1950 we had 40 cities, but we really didn't think as a species or as a governance structure much about cities. And then just look at in the year 2000, 2050, and 2100, the scale of increase in cities, especially the big cities. And big cities really do punch above their weight, and I'll try and show that a little more. So here we are. I don't know if you can see this very well, but just have a look at from 1500 to 2100. These are the world's 10 largest cities and where they are. So in 1500, Beijing was the largest city in the world, and it had 670,000 people. Then we had Moscow popping up in the 1800s. London was the largest city in 1900, New York. But what I think is really important on this slide is if you just get a sense of where the size of the largest cities. So, in 1500, 670,000 got you the world's largest city. In 2100, we're looking at almost 80 million people in a city. Enormous growth in cities, and really a push towards city is coming in sub-Saharan Africa. We're going through the Asian urbanization right now, started in East Asia, now it's in South Asia, and then from there, around 2040, 2050, we move into sub-Saharan Africa. So and there's lots of discussions about this, and from an energy and material flows, it's much easier. From a big geopolitical decision, it tends to be more difficult because big cities don't always equate to geopolitical influence. But up until today, it's been a really impressive surrogate measure for the influence of countries. Those countries that had the biggest cities tended to have the most power, and we haven't seen anything change that yet. Although I think what we're starting to see is that a lot of us just don't believe that by the end of the century, without a doubt, sub-Saharan Africa will be the most powerful part of the planet. And we're saying, well, no, wait, hang on, big cities, they just won't have the power. But if you look at this, so in 1800, Africa had of the 100 largest cities in the world. By 2100, they're likely to have 36. Asia, we often talk about the Asian century, that sort of thing, but really Asia started off in the 1800s with 65 of the largest cities. It declined, and then we had the emergence of really let's call it the West, or the OECD countries that we think of now. But that's actually pretty well plateaued in Asia. We're actually at 46 cities right now in the top 100 are Asian, but that's going to stay roughly the same, and that's East and South Asia. But if you have a look at Europe, that is where the decline in global influence is the most impressive. So in 1900, when the world was kind of being carved up with colonialization and then the emergence of the United Nations, it was first the League of Nations, that sort of thing. It was really a European-driven agenda because Europe had over half the world's largest cities. But by 2100, Europe might be lucky to have 3 of the top 100. So that really changes the game of, he who pays the piper calls the tune, and Europe ain't paying the piper much longer. And you can see that decline really significantly. Latin America and Caribbean, a little bit of a bump in 2000. It was actually, the peak was a few years before that. Slight decline, but roughly the same as North America. And Oceania, sorry, New Zealand and Australia, your influence is waning significantly as well. So if you're teaching students today, we're trying to say, think about working in Asia, but also make sure you learn the countries of Africa and the cities of Africa, because that's where either you or your kids are going to be working. And we also have this work that a few of us have started on, Nadine Abraham, Ian Stewart, a few others. We're trying to figure out where are we headed with these mega regions. Everybody loves the concept of, well, they don't love it, but everybody's recognizing the concept of mega regions, which is when you just get a bunch of cities stuck together and starting to behave as a common urban agglomeration. So the Great Lakes region is the largest mega region in the world, not by population, but by economy. And you can see that if you were a real estate investor, you would probably be looking at Mumbai and Delhi. But if you were a long-term real estate investor, you'd be looking Lagos, Gabon, Accra. So this is, sort of the Wayne Gretzky approach to skate to where the puck is going. The puck is going to big urban agglomerations, Asia, and then Africa. So what we did was Kevin Pope and I, we plotted the world's 200 largest cities under the 5 socioeconomic scenarios that are pretty common. I think most people know about them. We cheated a little bit, and SSP3 really incorporates SSP4 and 5. So SSP1 is sustainability, is our best bet. SSP2 is business as usual, and SSP3 is, well, it's just ugly. And so I don't know how well you can see it, but what you notice in the distribution of the 200 largest cities is that if you want to get to SSP2, more sustainability, you actually want to grow your cities faster and larger. And the less sustainable the world's growth trajectory is from here until the end of the century, the larger the population growth in African cities. So that's a big deal. And then this is the same thing, but showed for the population of the 200 largest cities combined. The other one was the number of cities, and this is the total population. But just have a look at SSP3 there. The difference between the total population in African cities within those 200 largest cities, but the difference between SSP1 and the difference between SSP3. So 600 million versus more than a billion. So a difference of around 450 million people, which is a staggering number if you think about it. And the difference between SSP1 and SSP3 really is public policy, how well we get along with each other and how well we sort of take responsibility for where we are and work collectively as a planet, I guess. Okay, so this is just another way of showing the same thing, that if you're the Minister of Finance for Japan, let's say, as an example, or even the US, and you're worried about your relative place in the world come 2050, 2075, you're terrified because your population is declining significantly. And even if you look at New York, so New York will remain the largest city in North America, probably the richest city in North America, and it is still doing quite well between now and 2100. But look at how it declines significantly in its relative place in the world in the 100 largest cities. Los Angeles, for example, goes from the 13th largest city down to the 40th. And then we have Toronto, just because we're in Canada, we had to put this. We actually had to create a whole new line for Toronto because they're not even in the top 25. But everybody loves to, in Canada anyways, loves to whine about Toronto and how fast it's growing and it's crowded and oh, yuck, yuck. Anyways, it even after all of its growth, there's even odds whether or not it will be in the top 100 by the end of the century. And really, up until now, it's been big cities where the money has resided that have called the geopolitical shots. And you can really see how Japan and Russia, and the U.S. and Canada, all of Europe is declining in geopolitical influence, and that's exactly the same in terms of material and energy demands as well. Those declines move perfectly in sync. The population, wealth, and material and energy flows. Okay, so I guess that's I don't know if it's good news or bad news. I suppose it's just news. Cities are changing. So really, when you look at the degree of sustainability between SSP1 and SSP3, we kind of have arguably a three-trick pony on how to get to sustainable cities. So these are sort of the three buckets that we would say. So the first one, sort of biomimicry, I love this quote, you know, that's not good for the hive can't be good for the bees. You know, Marcus Aurelius was thinking about this. We really have to figure out how to build cities that are welcoming to all of the residents. Cities at the moment are exacerbating inequalities, both nationally and locally. So that's one big challenge. The other big challenge is, this is a slide, a figure from West and Betancourt's work on cities, is that as you grow larger and larger cities, you have to innovate more and more in terms of delivery of services and energy. And the challenge that you have with that is that the pace of innovation has to continually increase, and you can see that obviously that's not very sustainable. Sooner or later, you just can't keep up with the growth. This, I only added this. I read this. This is one of the best papers I've seen. I just wanted to throw this up, that especially with an ISIE conference, is that really at the end of the day, the people who are going to drive the greatest amount of sustainability, I think, are the ones who are going to drive the greatest amount of sustainability within cities. And an urban metabolism approach is what gets you the closest and the fastest to sustainability at a city level. The planet just can't handle everybody living out in the countryside. We're all moving to cities anyway. So the challenge that we have is building sustainable cities, and that's the whole urban agglomeration. So this just has 6 different themes or approaches to urban metabolism, which I thought was a really good overview. Okay, so the first one, this didn't turn out very well. Anyways, the power tools, I think everybody knows this, working on cities, that cities scale super linearly for the good stuff, so most of the good stuff, although I guess crime and a few other things are in there in the good stuff. But cities, the economy of a city grows super linearly, while the cost of getting you there grows sublinearly. So if you double the size of a city, you will increase the economy, all things being equal, by 1.15 times, but the cost of infrastructure is 0.85. So that, in a nutshell, is why there's so much influence around the world in growing cities. It's a natural phenomenon. And this is a great slide from a paper that was done in the U.S., which looked at the cost of wastewater treatment plants across the U.S. And basically, the bigger you are, the cheaper you can do it and more efficiently. Now, of course, you run into what Ed Glazer would call the demons of density, which are things like crime, congestion. But when it comes to providing energy and material flows, bigger cities make it easier. So this is kind of what I would argue is again the most important, or the money slide, or the hopeful slide. And this is from Dana Meadows. This is us taking what Dana Meadows has had, our famous systems engineer, and saying, how do we apply systems engineering or systems thinking to our cities? And sort of, this is our top 12, going from least influence to greatest influence. And you can see that the resilience is a huge issue, as is the ability to measure and to understand where the city is going. So it may come across as really boring and mind-numbing at times, but we really need to figure out what's happening with energy and material flows in cities, because by having influence at that level, you can have significant impacts on the overall city. The rules of the system of a city, that's so number 5, is really a big deal. There's an interesting aside here in Toronto. We're having a really big fight right now between the city governments and the provincial government, where the provincial government is the one basically making all of the rules of the city and arbitrarily changing plans and taxes and these sorts of things. And this basically tells you that if you do that too much, you're going to screw things up from a material flow and energy flow perspective. So provincial and national governments kind of have to see cities as the golden geese, that you can be careful how you handle the goose, I guess, is the rules of the system for number 5. Goals of the city are quite important, the whole city paradigm. And I think this is the argument for sustainability of how we get there, is that cities will start networking and developing city paradigms where they work with each other. So London with Paris, with Lagos, with Jakarta, developing material flow analysis, energy analysis, greenhouse gas emission targets, these sorts of things, not outside of their national and provincial or state requirements, but probably as a way to fast track a lot of that. And I think that gets to Meadows' number one intervention in urban systems, which is basically getting away from the paradigm. And I think a couple of the paradigms that we will likely transcend or change over the next 50 years will be the role of cities, especially big cities, in global governance. I think network effects will start taking place. You'll have, and it'll be driven by, hopefully, by good information. And it's the whole cities with their focus on information will be the counter to Donald Trump's fake news, or sharing the wealth and also sharing the greenhouse gas emissions. You can pretty well see 30 years from now we have geoengineering is going to start emerging, and I don't think that cities will let countries be the sole arbiters of that decision. Cities will exert influence in different ways, and let's just hope it's positive. All right, so the three big challenges for cities: we really need ever accelerating innovation, and we know that that's just not sustainable. There's also, there's lots of hope in Jeffrey West and Betancourt's work on cities as scaling, and larger cities get you more efficiency. The challenge with scaling is that we haven't seen it scaling across national borders yet. Even so, all of the work is done on city scaling, let's say, for example, in the US, or there's a really good paper by researchers in the Netherlands that are looking at scaling across political borders, and they're finding that the benefits of scaling are held up by political borders. So that's why I think increasingly that will be an area where this whole cities as political entities will figure a way to drive much of the debate in a different way. Maybe. Okay, so this is my favorite picture that I found in Al Jazeera, and this is Betu. Betu is now 16 years old. The picture's 2 years old. Betu is in Mozambique, and Betu was taken out of school to sell oranges. He makes what does he make? 75 cents a week selling oranges, which was enough to take him out of school by his parents. His sister's also been taken out of school, and if you remember, Beru and Mozambique was just hit by a massive cyclone, massive destruction. And I think that that's just sort of a precursor or an early heads up. And I just wanted to sort of show a perspective from Betu that might not always. Now these numbers are a bit old, but this is basically. So we have two things going on. One is Mozambique and people like Betu are being hit harder and sooner by climate change than anyone else, and they're being taken out of school today because of economics, and they are going to see figures like this, probably already are, about who's really responsible for the global greenhouse gas emissions. And this is just, I think, a really powerful figure. It's out of date because now Canada is actually above the United States. That's how you can tell the age of a figure these days, sadly. Anyways, So you look at the countries that are in red, and they are the high income countries. They represent 48% of the global emissions. And they're 1.5 billion people, 2 billion. You get China and India, 49%. The numbers have changed. They're roughly now equal. But then you get the low income countries where Betu's living, and it's 2.5%. So this is a great way, I think, of showing the enormity of the market failure of climate change, that those who are least responsible for the problem are those who are being most impacted. So you have this whole fight with it, carbon taxes, cap and trade, or whatever we do with it, the Paris Agreement, and we're kind of dreaming in Technicolor, the rich in particular. So we've got the Japans, the US, the Canadas, where the problem is going to be manifesting as the cities in the south, to a large extent, are growing significantly in population, significantly in wealth, and significantly in political influence. So if you're a selfish Canadian or a selfish American, the thing that would make the most sense is to come up with a binding climate agreement, because we're going to be our kids are going to be the ones from the richer countries who are the most challenged in terms of dealing with the ramifications. Another way of just showing that same argument is, hopefully this shows up okay, but you can see there's two lines on that. And these are the greenhouse gas emissions from the world's largest cities, 100 largest cities, plotted by per capita greenhouse gas emissions and GDP. And you can see there's those two lines. There's the 450 parts per million by 2050 and 550 parts per million by 2050. Well, if you look at that slide, you can see pretty quickly that we're dreaming in Technicolor if we think we're going to come in anywhere near 1.5 degree as outlined in the Paris Agreement, which would require all of those cities, all of those green dots plus Toronto in the red, to be in that bottom right-hand square. 2 degrees, we all have to be below the red line, and that is the equivalent of 200, 300, 400 moonshots in terms of getting the cities to that level of greenhouse gas emissions. But I did want to point out just a couple things. If you look at Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, and Barcelona, and Mexico City, those are kind of the good news that we know how to get there and we can do it. And this is another way of looking at the same thing, that a paper that Chris Kennedy, Nadine, Ibrahim, and I did on, do we know how to get to where we want to go from where we are? And the answer is actually, it's pretty straightforward from a technological perspective. This is basically all the largest cities plotted on where they are in terms of population density and greenhouse gas emissions. And it doesn't take, again, a rocket scientist to figure out where the cities are and why. And really, we know that we got to clean up the electricity grid. We need, ideally, it should be below 50 grams per kilowatt hour. That's attainable. We have that in several countries and provinces. And then electrify everything, transportation and home cooling, and we can get there. It's just, at the moment, we don't have the political will, and we're not willing to pay for it. The other issue, I think, that if you're going to talk about climate change, that we really need to talk about is that the driver of climate change mitigation in most of the world, I think, is still local air pollution. Is the benefit that you would get that's actually a greater benefit than global climate change. So it's kind of to some extent, it should be a no-brainer that we know how to clean up the air in these cities, and the side benefit, so the economic drivers of cleaning up the air in these cities is sufficient to do it just on changes to local air pollution, and the ancillary benefit would be reduced mitigation for climate change. But we're not there yet, sadly, and really we're not there yet because coal is a 4-letter word. whether it's in China or India, the world is still using a lot of coal for electricity generation. And even if we move to electric vehicles, if it's coming from coal, that doesn't do us much good if the electricity comes from coal. Okay, so most people have seen this, I would think. It's been updated by Stefan, but this is the original one by Rockstrom. The planetary boundaries, where are we? Welcome to the Anthropocene. Apparently it's now, the cartographers have said that it'll be the 1950s and it'll be marked by the global testing of nuclear armaments. We're in the Anthropocene. We've crossed the threshold. This is, again, you can tell how old your slides are, sadly, that we've actually transgressed another one, apparently, on land use. So Stefan has updated it. And if you were looking at the dashboard of planetary sensibility and driving of the planet, we've got lots of redlining going on. So we've created as a planet the Sustainable Development Goals, which is, there's 200 and some odd individual metrics within these. This is a great example of why you never let thousands of people negotiate anything, whether it be the World Bank or the UN or whatever. We have the Sustainable Development Goals, which are great, but they are a challenge to get there. And I would make an argument that the best way to get to the Sustainable Development Goals is to ask the level of government, the only level of government in the world that would never create goals like this. You can tell that you had people who were representing the Ministry of Environment or the Minister of Finance or Gender or whatever. So you have all of these kind of pillared or stovepiped or siloed goals, whereas you need a local government where basically we're only going to achieve these if we achieve them all together. And the level of government, the degree of pragmatism in local government is what's going to force all of us to basically figure out how to get these, and we're going to have to get them kind of all at the same time. And arguably, the two things that are the most important, now this is just for a few cities that we have, is energy. Energy is a great surrogate for overall environmental impact. So what we've done is we've plotted the 150, I guess we have now, of the world's largest cities, of where they are today in terms of energy demand, and then where we think they'll be in 2050. And then with that, we can come up with a pretty good idea of greenhouse gas emissions and how close they are to a Paris Agreement or any sort of targets on greenhouse gas emissions. So we have lots of countries, in fact, arguably just about every country, that's saying, oh, here's our targets for greenhouse gas emissions, and they know that they're full of nonsense, because they know simply by going with the largest cities in their country, they can figure out how close they are to meeting any of these objectives. And a lot of these countries are just lying through their teeth, hoping that people don't add up the numbers. But if you start adding up the numbers from even just the largest cities, let's say the largest 200 cities in the world, it gives you the ability to say, hey, you're full of it, because you're not really genuinely trying to meet these targets, unless you're willing to say that by 2050 we're going to turn off all electricity in these cities, which we know is not going to happen. So by looking at individual cities, you get a pretty good scale of the challenges ahead. So what we did was basically we took Rockstrom's great idea and said, well, what if we made planetary boundaries, even though they're global and they're not even national, but if we tried to represent where individual cities, big cities, the urban agglomeration, is with respect to those targets. And we did that for both biophysical, and then we added this, instead of Rayworth's sort of the donut, we did the same sort of thing for socioeconomic indicators, which is probably not as robust as the biophysical, but is still pretty good. We know where the individual cities are, And we know that you can't go to a city and say, hey, you should worry about your greenhouse gas emissions if they have incredibly high infant mortality or no potable water or those sorts of things. So we did that for Toronto, Chicago. We have the same thing, and you can see that again. It's land use impacts. It's the impacts of wealth really, and in the States, there's a big impact still on crime, violence, inequities, which is in most big cities. But then you start doing this for cities like Lusaka. You can see here that it really is the socioeconomic challenges that they have. So each city has common, shared but differentiated priorities with regard to sustainability. And then we just did the same thing for energy. But the one thing that we didn't do, which would be much more effective, is to show the difference in scale. So for example, you can still see, so this from 2010 to 2050, it's like an 8-fold increase in total energy for a city like Mumbai. And you can still see the reliance on coal and oil come 2050. Now, people may argue that these are pessimistic, but these are really the best professional judgment from an energy perspective of what we should be contemplating. So if some city is more aggressive in moving towards renewables, for example, bless their heart, these Sankey diagrams in terms of energy flows could be readily changed and updated every year. And we have the same thing for a city like Dar es Salaam. I mean, people still don't have I don't think, a full appreciation that a city like Dar es Salaam, if you look at this, still the majority of its energy is coming from charcoal. I mean, this is crazy in 2020 and we know the health impacts of that. We know the challenges. So, we had kids out protesting climate change on the streets, but we also need the same degree of moral outrage that we haven't figured out how to address those challenges. The number of people dying from indoor air pollution and the fact that people living in Dar es Salaam basically are using 1/100th the amount of energy that somebody in Los Angeles is, for example. Anyways, that's my soapbox. Okay, and then out to 2050, you can still see that biofuels still take up a big share of the energy. The last sort of point that I wanted to make was from a civil engineering perspective. This is a great figure from The Economist. Basically, I think the civil engineers have, if you wanted to blame any one group for the mess that the world is in, I think the civil engineers bear the greatest share of responsibility. And why I say that is if you look at the degree of innovation increase in the construction industry, that we basically had no improvement since 1947. If you look at agriculture, a 16-fold improvement in efficiency. Manufacturing, 8-fold. Overall, the global economy is four times as innovative or efficient, and yet the construction industry hasn't budged. It's actually gone down a little bit. So McKinsey is wailing and gnashing of teeth at McKinsey, largely because this is a great place to make money. And that's actually what's happened, is everybody's been making money in the construction infrastructure business, but nobody really, from a infrastructure perspective, from the local politics, the social licenses of how do you get more efficient construction, civil engineers have been asleep at the switch, really. If you look at, and it's really difficult to have an effective professional response when you look at the woeful lack of productivity over the last 60 years. All right, that's my last soapbox. Okay, so just a summary. I think from a city's perspective, we're about halfway there. World cities are going to double over the next 35 years. So, and the energy requirements are going to more than double. Material flows. We know that solid waste is more than doubling. We know I had mentioned this three-trick pony. Basically, we're going to get to more sustainable cities through density, good public policy, and good, honest metrics that then help to better manage and better govern the city. And then we have the means to more sustainability is scaling and power tools. So the 1.15 versus the 0.85, a systems approach, and overall hierarchy of cities. And I think that's where we're headed. That cities are going to figure out a way to work more closely together. I don't know what that's going to take, and I don't know if the civil engineering or the industrial ecology people will be the ones who drive it. But I guess I pray to God that they are, or somebody steps in to help make these cities more efficient. Anyways, that's it, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thanks very much, Dan. That's a very dense presentation with lots to think about and to ponder over. I think we have a few questions coming in. Anyone who has any further questions, please either message to everyone in the chat, or you can message me directly. Either one is fine, really. I had a question, if I can just start us off. Looking at, if we can just take those high emitting countries per capita that you highlighted and the cities within them. If you look at all the emitting sectors within those high income countries, like in Europe and in North America, which sectors, well, I guess it's a two-part question. Which sectors keep you up at night because they're going to be such a challenge to achieve those deep cuts? And which sectors do you think you rest easy about? You're not as concerned about?
So I would just echo really Chris Kennedy's been working on this. I would say that we know how to get to where we want to go, and I think there might only be one path, and that really is to decarbonize the generation of electricity. And I don't care how you do it, but you do it fast. So that's solar, that's wind, that's nuclear, that's hydro. Recognizing that at the same time in countries, especially like Canada, the US, we need to focus on conservation as well. But by getting your electricity down, ideally below 50 grams, but even below 100 grams gets you the benefits, and then electrify everything. Electrify transportation. If you have to use hydrogen, that's fine. We know how to, and we can do that pretty quickly. In fact, I think we could do that over this, if we had the same intensity as, say, we were going World War III, we could do that over 10 years probably. So that's how we get there. The challenge, I think, is the non-technical, the non-engineering aspect, which is I just don't see the political will to get us there. Even though, if you get a bunch of economists, they would tell you that that's the way to go, a bunch of technical people. It's just that we haven't, we're just not there yet. I mean, Donald Trump was voted for. Doug Ford was voted for here in Ontario. Australia, Brexit. I think we're, as a group of people, especially city dwellers, we're just, the frogs are getting agitated in the boiling pot, but we're not yet ready to jump.
Right. So it's still this political will challenge that lays.
Yeah, I don't think it's technical. I mean, well, yeah, it is technical, but it's things like it's getting out of coal, for example. Now, the challenge with getting out of coal for electricity, to a large extent, is a geopolitical issue. India and China will not get out of coal. They'll argue that, yeah, it's an economic decision, but it's also geopolitics. If they become beholden to somebody for, I don't know, for selling them natural gas or uranium or solar technology or wind technology, they get very nervous, because historically, as countries, we've kind of screwed each other. And the challenge with that is, in the end, we're the ones who, collectively, we pay the price.
Right, right. I've got an observation here to share with you and to get your comment on. So a message from David Kay, who works in civil engineering. He concurs with this lack of innovation, and from his perspective, it's largely driven by local municipalities and ordinances being slow to adopt new methods or acceptable techniques. And if we want projects approved, we need to go the old-fashioned way because the new way will make regulators scared. If I've got that correctly. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, maybe. So I also have been the province of Ontario's chief safety and risk officer for the last 6 or 7 years, and nobody knew this. I never even knew this position existed. And all it really is kind of an observer and an honest broker. And I think that engineers, especially civil engineers, have been given this incredible responsibility with regard to public safety. Any engineer who is told by the politician that you have to build that bridge, but we know that the bridge is unsafe, will tell the politician to get stuffed. And the politician will not challenge the public safety aspect. And I think all its sustainability is a longer term and broader perspective of safety. Yet as engineers, we've fought over how do we quantify sustainability. Is this SDGs are a great example. Whereas if we as a community, as a profession, had said, no, hey, hang on a second, the factor of safety of a bridge is 2.2, whatever the number is, and the factor of sustainability is going to be 2.2, and we develop a method that honestly, measures the sustainability of the bridge, we would have the same influence, I think. But we haven't done that. We've kind of hidden behind the politicians and said, it's not for nothing that in the U.S. There's 800 and something elected people in the Senate and the Congress and all that, and 4 of them are engineers, and another 8 are scientists. So we've left governing to different professions and different means, and I don't think we've been at it for 70 years. We surely could have come up with a better way of saying that just doesn't make sense.
Okay.
Easy for me to say, I'll give you that.
Well, I mean, with the way things are going, there definitely needs to be a push from somewhere. Another question I've got. So, looking at the differences between mega cities and maybe more modest, medium-sized cities, and their difference in governance approaches, do you see any challenges in governance approaches between those different scales in stemming the energy and material flows towards more sustainable cities?
Yeah, great question. I think in theory, the larger megacities should be able to accomplish. If you argue that a cities you measure the accomplishment of a city by economy, lifestyle, well-being of its residents, then megacities should be able to do it more easily, simply because of the efficiencies of scale. However, the challenges come in that almost all megacities are plagued by far more intractable political problems. Arguments over the border, arguments with the national government or the state or provincial government. And there's often, in the development community especially, we tend to say, well, we focus too much on the large cities. We should be focusing on the middle-sized cities, which is definitely true. It's kind of one of these things that we really need to address all cities. But I think the tools might be slightly different for the mega cities versus the medium-sized cities.
Okay, and another question here. So Nadine Ibrahim, who I'm sure you know, has asked whether you would agree or disagree that engineers have a role to play, but the technology is now available, and it is now the role of other disciplines to come on board and buy into the technology that we need to adopt. Has the that? Is it now up to the marketers, advertisers, behavioral experts, social economists to take the lead, or are we still there to play a role?
Hmm. Um, well, I'm very nervous about pigeonholing or putting any sort of profession in one group or another. We really are all in this together. I think that if there's one thing that engineers are forced to learn, it's kind of problem solving. And if you looked at the problem of global non-sustainability, you come to the conclusion pretty quickly that the only way we're going to get to sustainability is through better managed, better run cities that you then say, well, hey, hang on a second. So how do we know if they are better run, better managed? And I think the civil engineering profession comes in there pretty quickly for coming up with honest, verifiable metrics that everybody can buy into, not just civil engineers. I mean, the concept of a factor of safety for a bridge to me is so compelling. Or even when a cost-benefit analysis was done on the first piece of infrastructure, it was Napoleon and a bridge in France, right? That as engineers we come up with some pretty quick, dirty, if you will. I mean, that's the difference between, say, civil engineering and mechanical engineering is the scale. We're just allowed to be, more ballparkish in terms of our numbers. So civil engineers should be able to come up with a metric, a little bit like a factor of safety or cost benefit analysis that says, hey, this piece of infrastructure or this city is closer to sustainability because it did the following 10 or 20 things. And we don't care who does them. We just want to come up with a good metric of how close is that city to sustainability. Because it's not working at a country level. It's too easy to deflect the argument at a national level. It's got to be at a city level, and it's got to focus on energy and material flows, as well as the economics of how well the quality of life is for everybody in that community.
Interesting. So engineers as guardians of the metrics of sustainability. That's an interesting perspective. So we have just come to the end of our webinar time now. I want to thank you again, Dan, for coming on and doing the first in the Reborn series of Sustainable Urban Systems webinar series. And I wanted to thank all those who attended today. Just to note again that we will be posting the webinar online shortly through the ISA website, through some online video platform. But you will get a notification in your email if you've registered. So thanks to you all again. Thanks to you, Dan, and look forward to seeing you all again at the next webinar and at the ISA conference in Beijing.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Bye-bye.